Hey friends, this is Cathode Bias episode number 5. I just want to welcome everyone from sunny Miami, Florida. It's a beautiful day in February here down in Miami. It looks to be about 80 degrees today. Yeah, so I just want to talk a little bit today about my Superwoofer project. It's the Fostex FW800HS 31.5 inch subwoofer that I purchased late last year. Talk a little bit about the history of it, what I've done so far with it, and kind of where I'm going with it. So yeah, so just kind of going back to why I decided to build basically this gigantic subwoofer. About over a year ago, I kind of had this idea. Like, I have some high efficiency speakers back in my house in Tahoe that are also Fostex and have about 100 dB efficiency. But I wanted to build a subwoofer for them, but I didn't want to use a high powered amplifier. I wanted to use kind of a low powered amplifier to match kind of the set tube amplifiers that I was using with them there. So I kind of had this idea to build kind of like a 21 inch low powered subwoofer to go with those. But things happened. We ended up buying this house in Miami, got kind of busy with work and a few other things, and that project got put on hold and never really happened. But late last year, I was kind of like thinking about new projects for 2022, and I saw Devon Turnbull on his Instagram was started to show up with pictures of one of these Fostex subwoofers, and I was pretty intrigued by it. And I texted him to find out more about it, and basically I found out the model and found out what the sort of where to purchase it in the U.S. You can get these, I think, at Maddie Sound. The price has gone up considerably since I bought this, unfortunately, but I was fortunate enough to get one of these in stock and sent out the same week. Yeah, so basically the reason I wanted to go with this subwoofer versus a kind of like a powered subwoofer was I have these high efficiency Altec 604s that I bought late last year. I'm kind of getting more into horn speakers. I have 2 sets of Altec 604s. And I kind of wanted something that was a good match to the 604 that wasn't kind of like a more modern, high powered, high excursion subwoofer. And so what this Fostex really is, what's really unique about it is it's a large woofer, obviously, 31 inches, but it has very low excursion. It's only like 2 millimeters X max on it. So it moves the amount it can move is very limited compared to like a large subwoofer, which is good for tube amps because the dampening factor in tube amps is very low compared to like modern solid state amps. Also, it's just easier to drive, but the drawback of it, there's a couple drawbacks of it. One is that the enclosure that you need to build, as you can see behind me, is absolutely massive. I'd say too, the second drawback is really just the cost and the labor involved with building, buying the woofer and building the cabinet itself. So after I acquired the woofer, I was like, I really wanted to try it out and see like how it worked with the Altec. So my first pass was to just build it into basically an open baffle. And Todd Graham over at OKC Craft, who actually built my speaker stands, kind of gave me the idea to like, why don't you try an open baffle? Like, I use open baffles all the time. It looks like that speaker would work pretty well with the QTS, the QTS. I always get confused between QTS and QTC. I think the QTS of it is around 0.7, which is really ideal for open baffle. Tried it in open baffle, worked really well, surprisingly well, right? I could drive it with a low power amp, matched with the Altec really well, and it would drive very low and very clean. I was really like, what's really impressive about it is just like a lot of subwoofers work really well with electronic music, and et cetera, et cetera. But what this subwoofer I think really excels at is kind of like the lower octave of, say, like acoustic bass. Like I listen to a lot of jazz music with acoustic bass. A lot of the Blue Note reissues are I commonly play, and so some of them, like even the Mingus stuff, like has a lot of low, bass that's kind of more acoustic. And that's really hard to replicate, I think, with a lot of subwoofers. This one really, that's where this one really excels, is with that kind of content. But it also plays like traditional house music and stuff very well too. It just it doesn't have maybe that grunt that like a home theater subwoofer has. If you want something that's going to knock you out of your seat, this isn't really it. Even though it's huge, it has a different sort of design where it's a lot more subtle, than like a home 18-inch like home theater sub with a high power amplifier. So the amplifier I'm actually using to drive this is the Sound Valve's M60, which is kind of like a Dynaco MK3, a modern version of it, similar architecture with a circuit board. Had one, so that's what I want to use. I might change up the amplifier later, but that amplifier seems to be sufficient to drive this speaker. So what happened? So I had it in an open baffle, worked good, and Devon's like, you have to build the box. Devon Turnbull has one of these. I think his Instagram is Devon Ojas. I think Ojas is the name of his company. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try to build the box. So I did some calculations, and the recommended box is a bass reflex box. It's a pretty good sized box. I can't remember the exact dimensions, but it just was an awkward size for this room. And it's, in my opinion, really hard to tune bass reflex enclosures. So I started looking at what can I do for a sealed enclosure. And so I kind of ran the numbers, and I started realizing, wow, to get to a QT C that was reasonable around 1, you need to build an absolutely massive, like 75 cubic foot box, which is what I ended up doing. So the dimensions of this are basically 10.5 feet wide by 42 inches tall by 2 feet deep. That gives you an idea of how big the box I built was. And I took some inspiration from the box. First of all, I'm an absolutely terrible woodworker. I have no experience in woodworking at all. This is honestly like the first major project I've ever undertaken, so I knew the finished quality wasn't going to be there. This is more of an experiment to see like what I could do, how the box would work. And I read some old documentations from Electro Voice, and they basically just the Electro Voice made a 30-inch woofer too back in like the 70s and 80s. I can't remember. I think it's a 30W. And it was kind of like the first Superwoofer that really came on the market. And their recommendation was, I was reading on their documentation, it's like build it into the wall, or basically frame up a wall to basically build the enclosures. So instead of building like a traditional cabinet, that's what I did. I kind of followed the guidance of the Electro Voice docs to actually framed it like a wall basically. I think it's not 12 inches on or 16 inches on center. It's a little bit, I think it's closer to about 21, yeah, it's just exactly half of the 42, 21 inches on center, so it's a little bit, not quite framed to the same standard as a wall, but pretty close. I built it basically in 3 sections so I could get in this room. It was basically be impossible. That's one thing that's weird about this kind of, once you get to this level, you can't just buy one of these off the shelf. The reason is because unless you have a warehouse, which I know some people maybe listening to this do, you can't basically get it into a normal house. So if you want to have a woofer this size in your house, you basically have to put it together in your house. So that's what I did. I built it in 3 sections, and I basically framed it like 3 separate 42-inch boxes by 24 inches deep. And then I cut out all of the basically MDF, and this is actually 3/4 inch birch, plywood, for the actual outside of the box itself. I basically did all the calculations and did all the cutting and finishing before I actually put the box together. Then basically one just massive day, I got everything in here with my wife's help, just screwed the whole thing together like kind of like IKEA style, right? A couple tools I bought that were helpful were kind of like, one was like the countersink bit, like so all these screws in here are countersinked. One thing I will say, it just barely, I don't have as many screws as I want to get into the box. I just put it together with a fewer screws, thinking that I probably will take it apart to make some modifications, which I'm considering. So, how does it perform? Well, it performs pretty awesome, right? It really, I have to admit, the output of it is pretty impressive, especially at lower frequencies. And I guess Devon warned me, and he was actually right, is that like you're going to get a lot of resonance in the box. You really need to brace the box more. And that's what I'm going to do now. I actually talked to, again, Todd from OKC Craft, and he mentioned like some ways that I could basically brace the box using horizontal 2x4s into the box as well. So I'm probably going to do that and give that a shot and see how it goes, if it can reduce the resonance. But even with the like little bit of resonance that the box has, it isn't as tight as I'd want it to be, but man, it really can play low, and it can play extremely loud with a 60 watt amplifier. So I think it's kind of like mission accomplished on this. Like, I was able to kind of convince myself that I could build a subwoofer that could be powered with a tube amp that could be a good match to the Altex. Again, it's like, could you do this with a modern subwoofer with a high power amplifier? Yes, I tried that. It's kind of more like the challenge of it. Really, I really want to go for a full tube system, and that's kind of what I've done here, is built out a system that works in all vintage tube amplifiers. The one question is like, how is it crossed over, right? Because a lot of off-the-shelf subwoofers have crossovers. Obviously, this is just a driver. There's no power. There's no crossover. How do you cross it over? Well, I bought a miniDSP. It's kind of like a modern approach to the problem. It basically has a DSP that slopes at 18 dB per octave, and that crosses it over currently at 60 hertz. Is that ultimately where I want to land? No. Like, I really have my eye on a Luxman tube crossover, which is kind of like the as far as I can tell, the top of the line basically tube crossover ever built. Marantz built some as well, but out of the box they don't cross over low enough to be effective for this project. So maybe if I could get a Marantz and maybe modify it to cross over lower, that might be one way to go, or the Luxman. But the problem is the Marantz is kind of almost like a collector item, very, very rare. I think it's the Marantz, I want to say it's the Marantz 3. Is the crossover, the Model 3. I can't remember exactly, don't quote me on that. But then the Luxman was built kind of like in the 70s time frame. It's also very rare, but not quite as collectible. But they are in the thousands of dollars range. So I wanted to see how everything was going to perform first before I invested heavily into a tube crossover setup. But still kind of on my dream list, kind of maybe next projects, next things to go with the subwoofer. So kind of like, so what are the next steps here? Like, okay, maybe there's a couple of things. Well, the finished quality of the box is okay. I'm not a great carpenter, so I think it's presentable. It looks kind of good enough for like right now, but I really like, my dream would really like to clean up the finish quality on this, and maybe later this year I'll do that. And kind of in the near term, I think that really the objectives is to tighten up the box as much as possible. I might use some gaskets on there around some of the panels where they're attached to the box, and also probably like I mentioned before, brace the box just to try to decrease the resonance. I'd probably also redo where the speaker bindings are on the right side of it. It just isn't as tight as I like it. And the speaker posts I bought were not as quality as I would have liked, and they were kind of I kind of wanted to get the box together, so I didn't want to wait to get another sort of higher quality speaker binding post. So I'll probably rebuild that panel too as well, with the speaker posts on there, just to maybe get it a little bit tighter. So the next phase of this project, which may have to wait a while because I have some other things on my plate, including extremely busy at work these days, is going to be kind of just tighten up the box and see how tight I really can get it. But I would say this enclosure is probably about right. It definitely changes the temperament of the woofer compared to like the open baffle. Again, like a lot of people are really into open baffles because there's just so little correlation from the box. Yeah, you do get some correlation from the box. It's got a more boxy sound. I mean, you got resonance from the box, so you hear the box a little bit. But it also just makes it a little bit more, has a little more presence than it does in the open baffle. And I knew this was going to be the case with the QTC that I was targeting around 1.0. Just to get the QTC down to like back down to 0.7, the box was like, the numbers grow like exponentially. It's not even like, you basically have to go to an infinite baffle at that point to get the QTC down even further. So if you want to build a sealed enclosure, I kind of ran the numbers up and down, talked to Devon about it, and he ran the numbers too, and like really the closest you get is about 74, 75 cubic feet. This is a little bit smaller because of the internals of the box. Take some of the internal volume out of the box, so it's probably finished. I haven't done the exact calculations, but it's probably close to about 70 cubic feet. Could be a slightly bigger, I think, to maybe get the QTC down just a little bit, but it's really, they really get it down to something significantly lower. You got to go basically to an infinite baffle, and or you have to go to a base reflex enclosure, which is what's recommended from Fostex. I might try the base reflex enclosure again later this year. I have to think about it more, but I really need more planning out. And I really was kind of anxious just to see how it sounded in a sealed enclosure. So maybe my next attempt at a box, maybe in the fall, will be using the Fostex specification on the enclosure. It's just like I said, it's a really awkward size. It would kind of maybe cover the window in here. This size that I kind of spec'd out, it makes a lot more sense for this room. So kind of maybe finishing thoughts. Would I recommend this project? It depends, right? Is it worth it? Well, no, because I basically have more into the woofer than I have almost into my entire system. So if you're looking for just bang for the buck, I would say this is not it. This is not a bang for the buck type project. If you're looking for a low cost bang for the buck project, I highly recommend like a rhythmic subwoofer that has a servo control on it. You can buy them as kits. You can build them yourself. I have a rhythmic F12G. It's a great woofer. Sounds good with the LTEX. This is more like, I just didn't want to have like that kind of mixed match between a high excursion, high powered subwoofer with the Ultec 604, which is more of a high efficiency, lower excursion speaker. So I was looking for something that's a better match. So from that perspective, yes, if you're looking for the better match to the Ultecs, this is definitely a better match. It plays lower, has more presence. It sounds better for like kind of more acoustic instruments that play low, like the acoustic bass and maybe some bass drum. It has more realistic sound in those areas, but it's not for the faint of heart. I mean, I underestimated how much work it was going to be to build a box. And I think my wife was about ready to throw me out of the house because of how much materials there were, just how much was going on to build the box. It just was. I mean, just the number of 2x4s I cut like maybe something like 80 2x4s to build the entire box. So just the amount of even just cutting I had to do was high. As far as like other takeaways, I'd say like, yeah, I'd probably rethink my tool selection. I use mostly a circular saw with a track to do most of the cutting. Not a super accurate way to go. Like I probably would use something more, especially for the 2x4s, like a chop saw, miter saw, like with something that's a little more accurate to do the cutting. I just don't have a lot of storage space. My house is in Miami, was built in 1920. Back then, storage space wasn't considered a high priority for houses. So even though my house is fairly large, it has limited storage space just because of the age of the house. So like I don't have really room to store like a miter saw somewhere and like in a table saw. But I think in an ultimate world, like if I was to go further, like I have to get access to something like that to really sort of up the game in my construction. So I think as far as like one of my goals for 2020 was to get better at woodworking. I think I'm going to take on a smaller project next and really try to nail it. This is okay, and it's kind of like definitely kind of like do it yourselfer style, but it's definitely not like something you would expect from a professional quality finish. And I think my next sort of project, I'm really going to try to aim like it's beyond okay. Like it's going to be like more professional quality, but something a lot smaller and something a lot easier, maybe like a record stand. So yeah, if you're thinking about the big woofer, I say yeah, I'd recommend it, but I just say keep in mind like what you're getting into. The building the box is not trivial. I underestimated sort of how hard it would be to do it myself. And it turned out to be basically a month long. Every minute I had free, I worked on it basically for a month. So just to give you an idea of like the complexity of it, both the planning it out and building it, getting the materials. One of the funny things, the first day they delivered the materials here, was because it's quite a bit of plywood and 2x4s to build this. So I had to have it delivered when they dropped it and broke all the materials. I had to have it re-delivered. So it was kind of like there was a lot going on to build this whole project, and well, I really enjoyed it. I think it really came out cool. It's a really unique thing. It's like it really maybe not for everybody, and I probably got in a little bit over my head on it, but I'm pretty happy with the way it's coming out. And my next steps are going to be just to tighten up a little bit. So yeah, that's kind of the update from Miami. I think the next kind of couple projects, a little bit of cleanup on the box, and then I'm going to work on the Fisher tube amplifier half, so that'll be my next project. Have some paperwork to do in the meantime, but probably start talking about the Fisher rebuild next and kind of getting planned for that and get more into kind of like the electronic side, which is I'm not an expert in electronics either, but I think it's a little bit more in my wheelhouse as somebody that's worked in software for 20 years. It's a little bit more it makes a little bit more sense to me than maybe I have more aptitude for the electronics than I do for building large physical boxes. So, anyways, yeah, it's been a fun project. I hope you keep following along, and I'm glad all the new subscribers have joined. I got 40 subscribers now. I know that's not a lot, but hey, you're here, and I'm glad to see you, and we'll talk soon.